the Amish compost method that creates rich soil. If you've been following along, you already know that everything traditional Amish gardening does exceptionally well traces back to one single foundation: healthy, living soil. We've talked about crop rotation, heirloom seeds, and succession planting, but none of those practices matter much if the soil underneath them is weak, depleted, or lifeless. And the single biggest reason Amish soil stays rich and productive year after year, generation after generation, comes down to one specific deliberate practice: composting, done the traditional way, not the rushed, modern shortcut version most people attempt today. Most home gardeners who try composting end up disappointed. They throw some kitchen scraps and yard waste into a bin, wait a few months, and end up with something that's either still mostly recognizable food scraps, or a smelly, slimy mess that barely resembles soil at all. And after one or two failed attempts, most people simply give up and go back to buying bagged fertilizer instead. But traditional Amish composting isn't a rushed, thrown-together process. It's a deliberate, time-tested method built around specific ratios, specific layering techniques, and patience that most modern gardeners simply aren't willing to commit to. In this video, we're breaking down exactly how this method works, step by step, so you can build the same kind of rich living soil that's kept Amish gardens thriving for generations. Let's start with understanding why this method actually works, because the reasoning behind it explains almost every step that follows. Compost isn't just decomposed organic matter. Done correctly, it becomes a living ecosystem, packed with beneficial bacteria, fungi, and earthworms that continuously break down organic material and release nutrients back into a form plants can actually absorb. The goal of traditional composting isn't simply to make waste disappear, it's to cultivate an entire microbial community that will keep feeding your soil for years after that compost is worked into the ground. The first key element of the traditional method is the balance between what's often called greens and browns. Greens refer to nitrogen-rich materials, things like fresh kitchen scraps, vegetable peels, coffee grounds, and fresh grass clippings. Browns refer to carbon-rich materials, things like dried leaves, straw, small twigs, and shredded cardboard. Traditional Amish composting relies on a rough ratio of roughly 1 part greens to 2 or 3 parts browns, layered deliberately rather than mixed randomly. This balance matters enormously. Too many greens without enough browns creates a wet, dense, oxygen-starved pile that turns slimy and produces a strong, unpleasant odor as it decomposes anaerobically. Too many browns without enough greens creates a pile that decomposes far too slowly, sometimes taking years rather than months to break down into usable compost. Getting this ratio right is the difference between compost that's ready in a matter of months and a pile that sits, barely changing, for years. The second key element is deliberate layering, rather than simply tossing everything into one messy pile. Traditional composting starts with a base layer of coarser browns like small twigs or straw at the very bottom of the pile. This bottom layer creates small air pockets that allow oxygen to circulate up through the entire pile, which is essential, since the beneficial bacteria doing most of the decomposition work need oxygen to survive and function efficiently. On top of that base layer, alternating layers of greens and browns are added, roughly following that 1:2 or 1:3 ratio mentioned earlier. Each layer is typically just a few inches thick, allowing for good mixing and airflow between layers, rather than dense, compacted sections that decomposition struggles to reach. The third key element is moisture management, something people frequently either completely ignore or dramatically overdo. A properly maintained compost pile should feel roughly as damp as a wrung-out sponge, moist enough to support the microbial activity responsible for decomposition, but not so wet that water pools at the bottom or the pile becomes waterlogged and anaerobic. Traditional composting typically involves checking moisture levels regularly, adding water during dry spells, and adding more dry browns if the pile becomes too wet after heavy rain. The fourth key element is aeration, achieved through periodic turning of the pile. Traditional composting typically involves turning the pile every 1 to 2 weeks, using a pitchfork or shovel to move the outer, less decomposed material into the center, and the more broken down center material out toward the edges. This turning process reintroduces oxygen throughout the pile, which speeds up decomposition significantly and helps prevent the anaerobic, smelly conditions that develop when organic matter breaks down without enough air. The fifth key element is incorporating actual manure, something modern composting guides often skip over entirely, but which plays a central role in the traditional Amish method specifically. Aged animal manure, typically from cows, chickens, or horses, is often layered into the compost pile alongside plant-based greens and browns. Manure adds significant additional nitrogen and a diverse range of beneficial microorganisms that dramatically accelerate the decomposition process and improve the overall nutrient density of the finished compost. It's important that the manure be properly aged first, generally for several months, since fresh manure can actually be too concentrated in nitrogen and potentially harmful bacteria to add directly to a garden without this aging process first. The sixth key element is patience, and simply allowing the process to take the time it genuinely needs, rather than rushing it. Traditional compost typically takes anywhere from 6 months to a full year to fully break down into rich, dark, crumbly finished compost, depending on the specific materials used, the climate, and how consistently the pile is turned and maintained. This is significantly longer than the rushed, few-week timelines often promised by modern quick composting products and additives, but the resulting compost is considerably richer and more beneficial for long-term soil health as a result. So how do you actually put this method into practice in your own garden, even on a much smaller scale than a full Amish farm? Start by choosing a spot for your compost pile or bin that gets at least partial sun and has reasonably good drainage underneath. Begin with a base layer of coarse browns, like small twigs or straw, roughly 4 to 6 inches deep, to establish good airflow from the very bottom of the pile. Continue adding alternating layers of greens, like kitchen scraps and fresh grass clippings, and browns, like dried leaves and shredded cardboard, aiming for that rough 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 ratio of greens to browns by volume. If you have access to aged animal manure, whether from your own animals or a local farm, incorporate thin layers of it throughout the pile as well. Check the moisture level regularly, aiming for that damp wrung-out sponge consistency, adding water during dry periods, and additional dry browns if the pile becomes waterlogged after heavy rain. Turn the pile every 1 to 2 weeks using a pitchfork or shovel, moving outer material toward the center and vice versa, to maintain good oxygen flow throughout. Be patient and resist the urge to use the compost before it's genuinely ready. Finished compost should look dark, crumbly, and earthy, with no recognizable food scraps or plant material remaining, and it should have a pleasant, earthy smell rather than any trace of the original ingredients. Once your compost is fully finished, work it into your garden beds before each planting season, mixing it into the top several inches of existing soil rather than simply leaving it on the surface. Over years of consistent application, this steady input of rich living compost is exactly what builds the kind of deep, resilient, naturally fertile soil that traditional Amish gardens are known for. Every element of this method, the greens and browns ratio, the deliberate layering, the moisture management, the regular turning, the incorporation of aged manure, and above all, the patience to let the process actually finish properly, works together to create something modern quick-fix fertilizers simply can't replicate. Soil that gets genuinely healthier and more productive with every single passing year, rather than soil that stays dependent on the next chemical application, just to keep producing. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe, because next week we're covering exactly how to build a simple, low-cost compost bin from scratch using materials you likely already have around your home or property. See you in the next one.